I invite you to open up your Bibles to the book of Job, chapter 5. Job chapter 5, we'll be looking there in just a moment. It's good to see each one here this morning. Thankful for your presence with us, and especially our visitors. We appreciate you joining us this morning. Several months ago, I was listening to a series of lectures on the connection between what the Bible says and our food, on what God thinks about our food. Where it comes from, and what knowing about God says about our food. Well, that's not the point of the lesson this morning, but in that series of lectures, there was a speaker. His name was John Moody, kind of a quirky guy, which most people who speak in lectureships like that are. And anyway, he referenced an article that came from a passage here in Job chapter 5, and in verse 9. And this is the speech of one of Job's friends, Eliphaz. And as Brad said in his prayer, not everything Eliphaz says is right, but this is. And he notes there, it says, who does great and unsearchable things, wonders without number. He gives rain on the earth and sends water on the fields outside. And so he read this article that started from that passage and thought about God's wonders without number, specifically the rain. And we'll look at that article in just a moment. But it got me to thinking and reading more about God's creation and thinking of how I think about that. How do I, what is my estimation of God's creation? What do I think about God in connection with his creation? How much do I think about God in connection to his creation? And so that's some of the things that I want to talk about this morning, starting there in Job chapter 5, wonders without number. So to begin with, I want to talk about how the Bible is in awe of God's creation and how we ought to be in awe of God's creation. In Job chapter 5 and verse 10, it says that he gives rain on the earth. And that is the first reflection of Eliphaz when he says God has created wonders without number. He gives rain. Now, rain, for most of us, is a fairly mundane occurrence. It's not something we spend a lot of time marveling at. And in fact, it may be something we spend a lot of time griping about, either that it's coming or it's not coming, it's coming at the wrong time, there's too much of it, not enough of it. But rarely do we simply contemplate what exactly is happening when it rains and marvel at what's happening when it's raining. And so that's what this article did. It said, here is somebody who describes rain as a wonder. He says, is rain a great and unsearchable wonder wrought by God? Picture yourself as a farmer in the Near East, far from any lake or stream. A few wells keep the family and animals supplied with water, but if the crops are to grow and the family is to be fed from month to month, water has to come on the fields from another source. From where? Well, the sky. The sky? Water will come out of the clear blue sky? Well, not exactly. Water will have to be carried in the sky from the Mediterranean Sea over several hundred miles and then be poured out from the sky onto the fields. Carried. How much does it weigh? If 1 inch of rain falls on 1 square mile of farmland during the night, that amounts to 27,878,400 cubic feet of water, which is 206,300,160 gallons, which is 1,650,501,280 pounds of water. That's heavy. So how does it get up in the sky and stay there if it's so heavy? Well, it gets there by evaporation. Well, what is that? It's a nice word, but what does it mean? It means that the water sort of stops being water for a while so that it can go up and not down. I see. Then how does it get down? Well, that's condensation. What's that? Water starts becoming water again by gathering around little dust particles that are between 0.0001 and 0.0001 centimeters wide. That's really tiny. But what about the salt? Salt, yes, the Mediterranean Sea is salt water, and that would kill the crops. So what about the salt? Well, the salt has to be taken out. So the sky picks up 1 billion pounds of water from the sea, takes out the salt, and then carries it for 300 miles and then dumps it on the farm. Well, it doesn't dump it. If it dumped 1 billion pounds of water on the farm, the wheat would be crushed, the wheat would be crushed, and the soil would be washed away. So the sky dribbles the 1 billion pounds of water down in little drops. And they have to be big enough to fall for a whole mile without evaporating, and small enough to keep from crushing the wheat stalks. Well, how do all these microscopic specks of water that weigh 1 billion pounds get heavy enough to fall, if that's the right way to ask the question? Well, that's called coalescence. What's that? It means that the specks of water start bumping into each other, and they join up, and they get bigger. And when they get big enough, they fall. Just like that. Well, not exactly, because they would just keep bouncing off each other instead of joining up if there were no electrical field present. An electrical field? Never mind. Just take my word for it. I think instead we should take Eliphaz's words for it from the book of Job. I still don't see why drops ever get to the ground, because if they start falling as soon as they are heavier than air, then they would be too small not to evaporate on the way down. But if they wait to come down, what holds them up till they are big enough not to evaporate? There are so many more questions. Yes, I'm sure there's a name for that too. But I'm satisfied now that by any name, this is a great and unsearchable thing that God has done. And I think we should be thankful, a lot more thankful than I am. I appreciate that. Now, I don't know how much of that Job knew. I suspect he probably knew more of that than I think, because I think old ancient cultures knew more than we think. But maybe he didn't know all of that. Let me ask you this. Is it less impressive because we know more about it? It should be even a greater wonder the more we understand and see the vastness of what's happening in this one single element, this mundane element of life that happens all the time. Look at how much is happening in that one thing. And we just pass it by and maybe even complain about it. The Psalms, of course, are full of wonder. They're full of awe at God's creation. In Psalm 8 and verse 3, it says, "When I see your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you established, what is man that you remember him, and the Son of Man that you care for him?" One of the elements that comes from recognizing the wonder of God's creation is humility. That's the idea here, the humility that comes from looking and seeing what God has created and how do I fit into this. And not only that, but that God has cared specifically for man in this great and marvelous creation. In Psalm 19 and verse 1, it says, "The heavens are telling the glory of God, and the expanse is declaring the work of his hands. Day to day pours forth speech, and night to night reveals knowledge." That's what we've been singing about. We've been singing about what creation does in reflection towards God. Over in Psalm 33 and beginning in verse 6, "By the word of Yahweh the heavens were made, by the breath of his mouth all their host. He gathers the waters of the sea as a heap. He lays the deeps in storehouses. Let all the earth fear Yahweh. Let all the inhabitants of the world stand in awe of him. For he spoke, and it was. He commanded, and it stood." And so when we see the teeming waters of the ocean, here is God able to just gather them up and do with them what he will. We, on the other hand, are completely at their mercy. In Psalm 65, beginning in verse 9, "You visit the earth and cause it to overflow. You greatly enrich it. The stream of God is full of water. You establish their grain, for thus you establish the earth. You water its furrows abundantly. You smooth its ridges. You soften it with showers. You bless its growth. You crown the year with your goodness, and your paths drip with richness. The pastures of the wilderness drip, and the hills gird themselves with rejoicing. The meadows are clothed with flocks, and the valleys are covered with grain. They make a loud shout. Indeed, they sing. Can I suggest to you, this is very beautiful and very poetic language for very normal, everyday things that are happening, right? These are not out of the ordinary, unnatural things that are occurring. This is just somebody looking around and going, wow, look at all the things every single day that God is doing. And notice that he does say God is doing it. He doesn't have that notion that is so very ingrained even in Christian culture, that God sort of set all of this up, stepped back, and then it's a wound up clock that's doing its business. It is the idea that, look, when that rain falls, it's God sending it. When it waters things, that's God watering the things. When we receive the blessing of all of that, that is God giving those blessings. And so he speaks very pointedly in that way. Over in Psalm 4, really the whole psalm just speaks to the glory of God and his creation. He says of the heavens, he says in verse 2, wrapping yourself with light as a cloak and stretching out the heavens like a tent curtain. One of the things that I appreciate is you come to marvel at creation, its vastness, its grandeur, the intricacies, the complexities. And then the psalmist puts all of that in comparison with God and makes God to take those things that are so vast and says God just stretches it out like a tent curtain. God just wraps that around himself like a cloak. And so, however vast we make that, then we make God comparatively more vast, right? And more complex and more glorious and all of those things. So that's what the psalmist is doing with that comparative language. And so we want to appreciate that. Not just read by and say, oh, that's pleasant, but think, do I think that way when I look outside? Do I think that way when I look at the stars and the heavenly bodies, when I look at the grass and the fields and all of those things? Do I appreciate God in that? Well, another thing about that is not just that we marvel, though I think that's important in its own right, but that we appreciate the instructive nature of creation. In Job chapter 38, God begins his response to Job, and I believe also to Job's friends as he is answering a great many arguments there. But he begins by talking about what he has done in creation and where were you? What do you know about all of this? And one of the things that I think that is a takeaway from all of that, as in the article this morning, I don't know if Marshall watched about mosquitoes this week. We didn't even talk about this, so that was kind of interesting. But this article answering that question of why does God create mosquitoes? And one of the answers that is given there is, what if we don't know? Do you think you can just start taking parts of God's creation away and it not cause problems? He knows why he created those things. You don't. And I think that is one of the major points of Job chapter 38 and continuing, is God just saying, what do you know? You don't know anything about creation. But he does then point to some elements of creation and then gives the lesson that ought to be learned, I think by implication, especially as we compare it to Job's own words. So chapter 38, beginning of verse 8, who enclosed the sea with doors? When bursting forth, it went out from the womb. When I made a cloud its garment and dense gloom its swaddling band. And I placed boundaries on it. And I set a bolt and doors. And I said, thus far you shall come, but no farther. And here shall your proud waves stop. When you see that the ocean continues to stay within its boundaries, that we are not overwhelmed by the deeps, what God is saying is, I have put boundaries in place. I maintain those boundaries, and it's for your good, because you would be overwhelmed. Incidentally, that is in response, I believe, to something Job has said earlier when he talks about being bound up, being hampered and hindered by God. God is saying, when I bind things up, it is to help you. And so we learn that. Look over at the ocean. Are you learning anything about the ocean when you see that? A little bit later in the same chapter, in chapter 38, and really going through chapter 38 and 39, there's so many references to creation that I think answer specific things that Job and his friends have said. But here's one. It says, who prepares, this is verse 41, who prepares for the raven its provision when its young cry out for help to God and wander about without food? Earlier, Job has reflected, where is God when I cry out? It's the same word of the ravens crying out. And Job is saying, I cry out and God is not there. And God says, do you hear the raven cry? And do you see him supplied? Who do you think's doing that? And so he is making, I think, the same point Jesus makes in Matthew chapter 6 and verse 26, that there is not a raven that God does not tend to and care for. And if he cares for them, then surely he cares for you. And so we look around and we see that. When's the last time you paid any attention? I read a while back Lewis and Clark, a book about Lewis and Clark's expedition across the United States. And one of the things that was so fascinating is their knowledge of just so many things. They knew about every bird. They could hear the call of a bird. Oh, well, that's this. Or they could say, oh, I've never heard that call before. And I know about a lot about birds, so that's a new one. And they were discovering new species and so forth. Like if I hear a bird call, it's a bird call. I mean, I hardly even know the difference between one and the other. But here, I believe that in a different time and place, people did know more about those things. They reflected on those things, and then they reflected on what that said about God. Over in Proverbs chapter 30 and verse 24. Proverbs 30 and verse 24. 4 things are small in the earth, but they are exceedingly wise. The ants are not a strong people, but they prepare their food in the summer. The Shephanim are not a mighty people, yet they make their houses in the cliff. Maybe you have rock badger is a possible translation there. The locusts have no king, yet all of them go out in rank. The lizard you may grasp with the hands, yet it is in kings' palaces. And I think some of your translation will have spider there, as that's a difficult word to translate. But here's the point. I'll tell you what I think about ants. I think about how to get rid of them. I think about how to keep them out of whatever it is I'm trying to do. They are a nuisance and nothing else. But they're not just a nuisance. They're doing something. They're doing something that God wants them to do. God made them to do something, and not only did he make them to do it, he made them to do it in such a way that if you pay real close attention, you can learn something about how they're doing that. Locusts. You don't deal with locusts so much, but here it is. I mean, locusts, again, they are a nuisance. I mean, God sent them purposefully to be a nuisance on occasion. But even there, God says, pay attention. Do you see how organized they are? Every once in a while, you might notice something like that. And I do appreciate the wonder of, like, we're going down the road, and you know when the starlings are coming through and they're in these massive formations that are moving around, it really grabs the attention. And especially a little kid, wow, look at that. And who's directing that? Who's guiding them? Who's keeping them in order? That's the point here. They're able to get organized and do something together, and they don't even have somebody guiding them. And look at us, right? And so those are the sorts of comparisons that the proverbial writer here wants you to make. He wants you to come to creation, look and say, here are animals able to do and accomplish great and marvelous things, or small and marvelous things as the case may be, are you learning anything? Or, are they just in your way, nuisances, things to be ignored as much as possible because they get into our way? So we want to be more thoughtful. I will say this, as we're thinking about creation being instructive, that we ought to approach creation with the mindset, and we'll talk about this more in just a moment, with the mindset that somebody made that, and they made it that way for a reason. Now, having said that, not everything is acting in the way that the Creator meant for it to act. I understand that. I understand that as we observe nature, as we observe creation, we're not observing it from the Garden of Eden. And there are going to be abnormalities and so forth about creation. There are going to be times where creation acts outside of the norm. So for instance, in Genesis chapter 6, we've talked about this language in Job 38 where God says, I set the boundaries. Well, occasionally the water does go outside of its boundaries. And usually it's because somebody has invoked God's wrath to call the waters out from their boundaries. But most of the time, water stays within the boundaries. And in fact, God says in Genesis chapter 9 and verse 15, I will never let it go so far outside of its boundaries that it destroys the whole earth. So when you're observing, you don't observe the anomaly to maybe make a reflection about God. You observe the norm. What is the normal nature and aspect of creation? And I think that is going to be where we find the most telling things about God. Well, I want to talk for a moment about why we, I think, are more disconnected from these thought processes than maybe biblical writers and people of bygone days were. And I think, first of all, it's because we are more impressed and distracted with man's creation than we are with God's creation. You remember perhaps in Daniel chapter 4 when Nebuchadnezzar calls God's judgment on himself. And how does he do that? It says, beginning in verse 28, it tells us what Nebuchadnezzar did. All this reached Nebuchadnezzar the king. At the end of 12 months, he was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon. The king answered and said, is this not Babylon the Great, which I myself have built as a royal house by the strength of my power and for the glory of my majesty? While the word was in the king's mouth, a voice came from heaven saying, King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is said, the kingdom has been removed from you. Now, Nebuchadnezzar had likely more right to be impressed with himself than any of us. He had accomplished a great deal more than us. And so, at least from some standpoint, you can sympathize with a man who has become ruler of the world and had made wonders that everybody all over the world wanted to come and see, to look around and say, haven't I accomplished great things? And God says, not like you think. Not nearly so impressive as you think. What he should have done is looked at all of that and then looked up and seen how small it was. How insignificant it was in the light of the grandeur of God's creation. But he did not. He thought it outshined God's creation. And so, God judged him. God humbled him for that. We, even without having created a wonder of the world, are still pretty impressed. If not with ourselves, then with mankind in general. I think that we live in an age where we have exalted the ability and the power of man to accomplish great and wonderful things. And we have ignored the real and true limits, the very smallness of our actual accomplishments. Arthur C. Clarke was a sci-fi author. He said, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. You ever feel that way sometimes? You know, some new thing comes out and you just go, how does that even work? And I can't explain it. I don't know how cell phones work. I'm sure there's somebody here who could explain it, but probably not in a way I would understand. I don't know how, even something as simple as this, I don't know how waves can carry data, right? I get that it does happen, but I don't know how, right? So then you marvel. How about this? How about words carry power to create the whole world? Yeah, I know even less about that. And so my marveling at something that is impressive, I'm not saying it's not, is tempered if we're careful when we reflect, what do God's words do? What power do his words carry? In Deuteronomy chapter 8, bring it down to maybe a more manageable level. God says in Deuteronomy 8, and beginning in verse 11, beware lest you forget Yahweh your God by not keeping his commandments and his judgments and his statutes, which I am commanding you today, lest you eat and are satisfied and build good houses and live in them, and your herds and your flocks multiply, and your silver and gold multiply, and all that you have multiplies, and your heart becomes lifted up, and you forget Yahweh your God who brought you out from the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. There's nobody here living in a house that would not put in the shade the grandest house that any of these people were living in. There's nobody here whose flocks haven't multiplied in ways that would make the richest of Israelites envious. We have a lot more difficulty to overcome in our blessings and in our forgetfulness of God. And so as he warns these people, when you go in, not building the greatest city that ever existed, but when you just go in and you got houses and nice things and you're comfortable and you just stop thinking about God and what he's done and how all of that came from him. Well, that's where we live. Instead of thinking from the standpoint of, I can do nothing without God, we have people like Napoleon Hill, who's a motivational speaker, used to be. He says, whatever the mind can conceive and believe, it can achieve. Or maybe more familiar, Walt Disney, if you can dream it, you can do it. It's not true. There's a lot of things you can dream and then can't do. A lot of limitations. And people think that our limitations are only a matter of time and effort. It's not true. There are things that if you put enough time, you can achieve. There are things that if we work on it to the end of time, we will not get there. And we would do well to remember it. Because regardless of all the technological advances, we are not advancing near as rapidly as we think sometimes. And in fact, if we are advancing, it is often in the wrong direction. Along with that, we're led to a false sense of control. Because we have all of these tools and advancements, these technologies, we believe that we look at creation as something to be molded for us, by us, instead of something to be understood as someone else's creation. Now, a lot of that comes because a vast majority of people, well, I say a vast majority, a large portion of people who are in positions of power think that the world is not created, that it's simply happenstance. And so they look at it not as something with purpose, but rather something to be managed for their own purposes. In Luke chapter 12 and verse 16, you know the parable of the rich man who had land that was very productive. And he says in verse 17, what shall I do since I have no place to store my crops? And then he says, this is what I will do. I'll tear down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grains and my goods. And I will say to my soul, you have many goods laid up for many years to come. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. In James chapter 4 and verse 13, of course, the one who says today or tomorrow, we will go to such and such a place, we will buy and sell, we will make profits. What do you know? I'm reading a book called Fooled by Randomness. And it talks about people who go along in life and assume because things have been a certain way, they will always continue to be that certain way. And particularly, he talks about people who make financial decisions based on that. And guess what? They all get burned throughout history. Everybody who goes on assuming that things will always stay the same, they never have. Now, there are some things that always stay the same. And over the long term, there's adjusting to the mean. But I tell you one thing that I marvel at is that no matter how many failures, no matter how many stories of great crashes, individual and national, people still go in going, yes, but I will beat it. I will control, I will have control over decisions and so forth in a way that nobody else has. Just look at nature. You cannot predict it. You cannot control it. But we approach nature like that. And I think in addition to that, the great hubris is that we look at nature and we don't think, how did God create this? How did God want me to use this? We look at it only from the standpoint of, how can I make this most convenient to me? And what happens, and I think there's some degree, I think God expects us to cultivate. I think he expects us to do things with his creation. But I think what that's ultimately led to, that sense of total control, is now people look at their own bodies. And they say, I'm not bound by what God created. Now I can change it. I can rework what God has made into whatever I want it to be. And I can do it without consequences. And what people are finding is that while there may be room for modifications and cultivations along the way, there are great limits. And those limits are communicated through considerably devastating consequences, as we are seeing all around us. I think another thing is we think that technology, we've supplanted wisdom with technology, and we think technology is a stand-in for wisdom. Yes, this is a commentary on ChatGPT, on AI. People have gotten the computer so big, and so now we can just ask the computers a question, and they'll tell us the answer. And those computers are smarter than we are, aren't they? Just this past week, incidentally, there was a story that was recalled in a couple of news outlets. And the story had to be recalled because it was just blatantly false information. And somebody said, well, ChatGPT said it was true. I'll tell you what, that journalist ought to be fired on the spot. But they thought this is smarter than old-fashioned wisdom, going and verifying your facts. In Job chapter 28, Job talks about all that man has been able to accomplish. He talks about they've been able to mine for silver. They've been able to take light into the farthest distances into the earth and bring whatever they want out of the earth. And look how impressive man's accomplishments are. But in verse 12, he says, but where can wisdom be found? Where's the place of understanding? I don't care how good the AI models get. They are like the gold mines. The value you can get out of them will always be limited. He says, man does not know its worth, and it is not found in the land of the living. Verse 23, God understands its way. He knows its place, for he looks to the ends of the earth, and he sees everything under the heavens. When he set weight to the wind and meted out the waters by measure, he set the limit for rain and a course for the thunderbolt, and he saw it and recounted it, and he established it, and he also searched it out. So he said to man, behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom. And to turn away from evil is understanding. Elon Musk is part of a company that is trying to develop the ability for people to download their brains into hardware. And so that you could basically exist with computer hardware and your brain downloaded into that. Here is someone who thinks that we are simply advanced technology. But we're not. We are created by a Creator who breathed into us the breath of life. And you can't get that by soldering wires together. So we're going to have to step back from a lot of those, maybe the greatest reaches of man's dreams of technology and say, no, that's not even on the docket. It's not on the table, because life is not what you even think it is. I'll say another thing that makes us disconnected is I believe we do not recognize objective beauty. Here's what I mean by this. First of all, I mean that what's happened is we've talked about the Enlightenment and movements like that basically said everybody, every individual has a right to his own destinies, to his own paths, to his own ways of thinking. And everybody's way of thinking is as legitimate as everybody else's. Right? So your opinion is just as important as the other guy's opinion. And even your alternative facts are as important as the other guy's alternative facts. It's your truth. And so especially when it comes to something like beauty, we have phrases like, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Do you agree with that? I think there's a sense in which, sure, whether you think something's beautiful depends on where you're coming from, maybe what your understanding and knowledge is. But when Jesus says in Matthew chapter 6 and verse 28, he says, "And why are you worried about clothing? Observe how the lilies of the field grow. They do not toil, nor do they spin. And yet I say to you that not even Solomon in all his glory clothed himself like one of these." Can I suggest to you, if somebody comes along and goes, "Well, I don't think lilies are all that pretty," that says more about you than it does about lilies. Lilies are beautiful. God made them to be beautiful. God clothed them in a way that he says that is glorious. And you're like, that's a you problem. And so what happens is we allow people to have completely non-objective opinions. And somebody says, I was talking to somebody about going to the mountains a while back, and he was like, I just don't get it. I mean, you go somewhere like that, you look, you see it. I'm not saying it's ugly, but what's the big deal? I'd rather watch a basketball game. Look, I love basketball. But you need to cultivate a sensibility about what God has created, that you see grander and greater things there. And if you say, look, it's just not my thing, it's fine if somebody says, for instance, about honey, I don't like honey, they might say. I don't think it's all that tasty. Okay, but the Bible talks about honey as if it's a universally understood that this is a tasty thing. So what you need to at least understand is if you don't like honey, you're weird. Right? Because God meant for that to be a tasty thing. You say, well, that's subjective. No, what God says is objective. And your subjectivity, because you've allowed yourself, maybe that's because you got a bad palate, maybe because you eat like a 5-year-old, I don't know. But there's some way that you've gotten off the course of what God said he made to taste good, to look good, to be beautiful, to be good. And we need to know what God says is good and beautiful and right, and what he says is not just morally wrong, but what he says is ugly. Somebody might say, I think the smell of a skunk's kind of pleasant. Now, I don't know who would say that, but maybe they would. Can I just suggest to you, God made that to stink? And if you think it smells pleasant, something's going on, right? So he made those things with purpose, but we have subjectivized the whole world so that beauty is just up to the beholder. And there's no definitive standards. God has standards. So how do we rekindle wonder in God's creation? Well, I think first of all, we just need to acknowledge God's daily hand in our life. Matthew chapter 6 and verse 11, you know in the Lord's Prayer, give us this day our daily bread. I think there are times and places, there are circumstances that make it easier to recognize how thoroughly each day God is granting us bread. And I think we don't live generally in those times and circumstances. It's a lot harder for us to see the daily provision. And so we have to maybe put some more thought process into thinking it is God who has given me this blessing. We need to think about God's role in creation as a continuing, sustaining power. In Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 3, it says, who is the radiance of his glory and the exact representation of his nature, and upholds all things by the word of his power, who having accomplished cleansing for sin, sat down at the right hand of the majesty on high. Present tense, he upholds all things by the word of his power. Over in Colossians chapter 1, similarly, in verse 16, for in him all things were created, both in the heavens and on the earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. The scientist who has dismissed God is examining things as if he sees all that is involved in that thing under a microscope. And what he doesn't see is the reality that's holding it up. You take God away, everything you're looking at a microscope, including the microscope, goes away. It is he that continues to sustain creation. This is, of course, how they would speak throughout the Old Testament. In Nehemiah chapter 9 and verse 6, you alone are Yahweh. You have made the heavens, the heaven of heavens with all their hosts, the earth and all that is in them, and the seas and all that is in them. You give life to all of them, and the heavenly host bows down to you. You continue to give life. You continue to supply. It's not just you did this, but you are doing this. Psalm 145 and verse 15, the eyes of all wait on you, and you give them their food in due time. You open your hand and satisfy the desire of every living thing. You know, I think that, like about providing for the ravens. When we look at a bird that jumps down and he eats up seed, and we think that the bird has gone and supplied for himself. God says, I'm the one feeding that bird. That's me. And you say, well, I've got a bird feeder. Where do you think that seed came from? Where do you think, it's always God feeding the bird. And in fact, why do you even want to feed the bird? Because they're beautiful to look at. Who made them beautiful to look at? Who made you want to feed the bird? God is doing all of those things. And we need to contemplate it that way. Psalm 147 and verse 8. He is the one who covers the heavens with clouds, the one who provides rain for the earth, the one who makes grass to sprout on the mountains, the one who gives the animal its food, and to the young ravens which call out. Several weeks back, after it had been dry for so many weeks and even months, it rained one day. And we were pulling out, and Rylant said, hey, it's raining. I said, yeah. He said, we prayed for that. I said, we did. And then God did it. He did. That's what I want. I want to think that way. It's raining. I prayed God would make it rain. He did make it rain. That's who's making it rain. That's how the psalmist thought. We need to kindle a daily thought process like that. We need to look for pattern and purpose in God's creation. In Psalm 104 and verse 19, it says, he made the moon for the seasons. The sun knows the place of its setting. You appoint darkness so that it becomes night, in which all the beasts of the forest creep about. When he talks about these aspects of creation, he says that in the night, verse 21, the young lions roar to go after their prey and seek their food from God. But when the sun rises, they gather together and they lie down in their dens. Man goes forth to his work and to his labor until evening. He says, I set this up with purpose. I meant for the thing that would kill man to go hunt at night while man's asleep. And so then man could get up while that animal's asleep, and he can go to work without wondering, generally, if a lion's about to come up and kill him. God made you to be awake during the day and to be asleep at night. I think just one thing. I'm not saying that night shifts are sinful. I am saying that you are trying to act outside of the way God made you. And I mean, just look at studies on people working night shifts, and it's not great. It doesn't have beneficial health effects. Because we basically said, I don't have to worry about that anymore. I don't have to worry about nature because we've got electricity, and now I can work all night. Guess what? You're still the person God made. You still have the very same things inside of you. And so, while you can act outside of natural functionality, it will come with consequences. That's just one. That's just one among millions of ways that we are just dumping God's creation to the side and acting like it'll have no consequences and no side effects. But it will. Because we're not paying attention. Because we're not acting like somebody made that and they did it on purpose. What we act like is like the evolutionists. All this happened by chance, and some of it worked out well and some of it didn't. If doctors look, if scientists look at our bodies and they say, the way our body does this is not good, I'm going to tell you what, that guy is the one who needs to step back and rethink. If he's talking about the way our bodies normally function, I know there's, again, abnormal ways, but if he's talking about the way his bodies normally function, I assume God knows what he was doing. And if I can't figure out what the body is doing with that body part or that function, I assume that the lack of knowledge is on my part and not on God's. I'm the one that doesn't know. But he doesn't just make us with creation, with purposeful biology. But in Genesis chapter 1 and verses 26 through 29, we've talked about this over and over, talking about men's roles and women's roles. God put men on the earth for reasons, to accomplish things, to act in certain ways in concert with creation. And our thought process ought to be, I want to know what that is. And we know it through God's word, and we know it by, I believe, looking at creation in conjunction with God's word. We put those together to have a better understanding of what it is, how best we can interact with the creation that God has blessed us with. Finally, if we're going to cultivate wonder, we've got to make room for it. We live in such a busy world. Who has time to think wondrous thoughts? Psalm 145, verse 5. On the glorious splendor of your majesty, and on the words of your wondrous deeds, I will muse. Amy, when we built our house, we were planning it out, and I had made the outside spaces, and she goes, that porch needs to be bigger. Why do you need a big porch? Stuff goes on a big porch. If you keep it small, stuff can't crowd up on the porch. I just want a place to sit outside in a rocking chair with my coffee in the morning. We don't do that anymore. We don't have time for it. We don't have time to slow down and look out at the fields. No, in fact, when people do look at fields, all they think is, how can I tear that up, subdivide it, and sell it? Instead of just looking at it and saying, do you see what wonders God is doing? Every single day, every single morning, every single evening, every single breath you take, God is doing magnificent and glorious things. And so you've got to take the time to think about that. And that may mean that you've got to schedule some time for it, because it won't come naturally. Naturally, we'll go right into the flow of culture, and culture is not heading this direction, which is what I would say in conclusion. What we are talking about in all of this is swimming upstream from the flow of culture. But can I tell you, that is always the direction God is. upstream from every culture that has ever existed. And this is just one more way that we need to swim upstream and go against the grain of the flow of where culture would take us. If there's anyone here this morning who has not submitted to this great and glorious Creator, understand, He made you. So, He knows. He knows what you're here for. He knows what your purposes are. And He knows what glories that He wants for you that await. If you would follow after the Maker. So if there's anyone who's not submitted to Him this morning, and if we can help you in any way, won't you let us know? Come forward while we stand and while we sing.